We dive into a deep but extremely important topic for episode 109 of the Love in Lebanon podcast. Denise Niblick with Mothers Against Drunk Driving Central Indiana, along with Boone County Deputy Prosecutor Kelsey Lenox and LPD Officer Austin McCloskey, who's also a drug recognition expert, join us. The trio previews an upcoming event and shares firsthand how impaired driving is still a significant issue in our area. Episode 109 starts now.
Welcome to the Love in Lebanon podcast, highlighting all the great things happening in Lebanon, Indiana. Have an idea for an episode? Send an email to loveinlebanon@lebanon.in.gov.
Hey everybody, welcome to our Love in Lebanon podcast. I'm Joe LePage, the host. This time around, we are going to preview an event coming up in September, so a little bit later on in the year, but at the same time raising some awareness and maybe educating you on a pretty important topic within our community and certainly Lebanon as well. Joining us for this episode, Denise Niblick and also Kelsey Lenox and Austin McCloskey. Guys, gals, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
And so we are talking about Walk Like M.A.D, Central Indiana. That's coming up on September 16th, 2023 at 10 a.m. That's at the Memorial Park Shelter. A little bit of time to mark those calendars. Denise, if we can, you're the one that's kind of wrangling everybody and why we're here today. Why is it so important that we kind of get educated on this topic within our community?
Well, thanks, Joe. Definitely very excited to be here, so thanks for having all of us. I do want to talk a little bit about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I actually live here locally in Lebanon, so I just want to talk a little bit about the partnership today that we're going to have with Boone County, and what my role officially is with M.A.D is actually a victim specialist or a victim advocate. So what this walk, the importance of this walk, I guess I should say, is to be able to come together and support each other, talk about prevention, talk about the loved ones that we have lost in our lives, those who have been injured by these drunk and drugged driving crashes. And why the walk is so important and why I'm thankful to hold it in Lebanon is because one, I love Lebanon, and I think we have a really, really great support system here. And because our Memorial Park has actually really great access. It's very accessible for a lot of our victims that will be coming. And the new park that we have, the playground, I think will be awesome to utilize for this event. The event is actually more of a memorial walk, so there's no certain distance, not like an officially timed 5K.
Gotcha.
So we will, just at the beginning, really be gathering together, thanking our first responders, law enforcement, talking about our partnership with them, talking about the goals for M.A.D. This is M.A.D's largest fundraiser that we put on, and we get together and just spend time together, talk about our mission and why we're here to stop impaired driving.
And so you're here kind of talking about from a victim's perspective. We have Kelsey here, who's the deputy prosecutor, and also Austin McCloskey, who is a police officer and DRE. He's an expert in the field with our Lebanon Police Department. So from different walks of life, chances are everyone listening to this podcast has heard about M.A.D over the years and a DARE officer and things like that, and going through our school systems. But if you can kind of talk about, and Kelsey, if we can start from you from a prosecutor standpoint, kind of what you're seeing and what led you to be sitting around this table and saying yes when Denise said, hey, come be on a podcast and share some of your expertise and perspective.
Sure, absolutely. Basically, right out of law school, I became an intern at the Marion County Prosecutor's Office in the drunk driving unit. They had a specialized unit at the time, and that's all we did day in, day out is drunk driving cases. And when I became an attorney in 2009, I was part of the drunk driving unit. So I spent about 9 years in Marion County, eventually did major felonies and whatnot. But then I came to Boone County about 5 years ago to do more drunk driving. And it's important because here in Boone County, it is the number one filed case in our county. So it's very prevalent. It is... it's a problem, and we thank our law enforcement every day for getting people off the road before they hurt themselves or someone else.
When someone says, when you share that fact and figure with them that it is so prevalent here in Boone County, is drunk driving, impaired driving, what's their reaction? Are they surprised, or is it something that, I could see that?
I do think there is some surprise because I don't think that people necessarily think about drunk driving or drug driving or impaired driving that often. They think of it as something that's far away from them. They will hear about tragedies in the news, but they don't know just how often these tragedies are avoided by detection and deterrence.
Numbers stay pretty stagnant? Are they going up? Or is it just prevalent year after year? I mean, it's just the way it is.
Certainly 2019 was our highest year on record, but then due to the pandemic, more people were staying in, not as much driving. However, unfortunately, this year we have seen a substantial uptick.
And Austin, being an expert in the field and working a lot of overnights, and don't want to be too stereotypical because impaired driving can happen at all day parts of day or night. But what are you seeing from a law enforcement perspective and being able to recognize and pick out those things that maybe highlighting someone that is driving while impaired?
It's absolutely a problem. I think I seen a stat the other day where one person every 45 minutes dies in a vehicle crash involving a drunk driver. So it's not just drunk, it's drug impaired driving, any kind of impaired driving, especially with the legalization of marijuana across the country. We're seeing a lot more people driving high, thinking that it's okay to smoke marijuana and get behind the wheel, and it's not. So yeah, it's a huge problem. The reason why I really got into it, got really passionate about it, was when I was in the academy. One of our instructors, he shared a story about when his daughter was killed in a vehicle crash involving a drunk driver, and that was, I think, 7 years prior to him telling us that story. And you could just still see the pain in his face. You could hear the hurt in his voice, and that's something I never want to experience with my own family. I know Kelsey mentioned it as far as the deterrence, and I believe an OWI arrest, like, it truly impacts the safety of the city because it affects the person who gets arrested, right? They're less likely to make that decision to get behind the wheel drunk, but it also affects the rest of the community where they're less likely to get behind the wheel because they don't want to get caught. So they're calling more designated drivers, which in turn makes the city a safer place because there are less impaired drivers on the roadway. And
being an expert in that, I mean, what goes into that to be able, what kind of training did you go through to be a DRE?
So we did 2 weeks in like an in-house training where they crammed us with as much information as they could. And then we went down to Jacksonville for a week where we had to do 12 evaluations on people, where people came and they used drugs, and then they just volunteer themselves to come to this homeless shelter to do evaluations. And so
that's real life. Like, it's not someone faking it or and trying to be stereotypical that way. It was actual impairment.
Yeah, it's just this homeless shelter where they come and they're real life, like they're on drugs, and we have to do evaluations on them. We have to see specific things, look for specific things, and be able to call what kind of drug they're on, what kind of drug category they're on. And it was very extensive, and it was a lot of work.
Yeah, it's important to note that actually every officer has to go through what they call SFST training, which is Standardized Field Sobriety Test Training, in order to be able to test people in the field that they've pulled over that they suspect might have alcohol impairment. What the DRE can do then is, if those people for some reason with the breathalyzer are what they'd say like blowing O's, blowing zeros, then they can look for additional signs of impairment, whether that be blood pressure, eye movement, things like that they have been trained and practiced to actually be able to see. And that's what is so, so important. And I am so thankful that you have gone above and beyond to go to this training and make that really part of your mission. We have 2 officers in Lebanon Police Department that are DRE to be able to really see those differences and perform those evaluations.
Come in handy?
Yeah,
that kind of training, have you seen that happen in real life where it's come in handy, that going down to Jacksonville and all those things?
Yeah, absolutely. It's helped out a lot, and it's gotten drivers off the road where before, I mean, the typical officer, as she mentioned, they go through SFSTs. They are looking for certain signs for a drunk driver, but those signs you don't actually display if you're under the influence of meth or heroin or cannabis. And so the typical officer might just let that driver continue on down the road because they don't see those signs. And then also it works the other way around too, where maybe someone might be showing signs of impairment, but maybe they're just sick. Maybe they have the flu or something. And so they call us down, and it helps prevent a bad arrest also.
If we can, Denise, kind of talk about your why. I mean, Kelsey's wanting to make her county a better place in Austin. From the academy, had a real personal story that impacted his life, and so that's kind of his why of engaging in law enforcement the way he is. Yours is a lot more close to home. If you can share, the reason why you're so passionate about it. You brought notes. You kind of coordinated this podcast episode. To be honest, I mean, this is real life for you. It's not just something that they would see a flyer on at a public place. It's something that maybe more impactful.
Absolutely. I actually lost my sister. You mentioned it's actually almost exactly 7 years ago. It was April 6th of 2016. My sister, Lisa Stree, she was my older and my only sibling. She was 26 years old when she was hit and killed in Hendricks County over in Avon by an underage impaired driver. And this person was impaired by alcohol and marijuana. And something that I think is really important to point out as we talk about impaired driving is a lot of people think, oh, it's just somebody who goes and gets completely sloshed, right? You hear about these in the media of, 0.1, 0.15, these crazy blood alcohol levels. But impairment starts happening at 0.02. So there is already impairment that we can see, loss of judgment, exaggerated behavior, and by 0.08, which is the legal limit, we see muscle coordination becomes poor. The judgment, the reaction time, it's really a recipe for disaster when it comes to car crashes. And something I also like to point out as we're talking about just the different types of drugs and impairment there can be, something that I'm seeing from the victim side is a large amount of prescription drugs affecting these people in ways that maybe they don't typically understand. Legally attained prescription drugs prescribed for maybe mental health, maybe for blood pressure, anxiety, things like that. Alcohol can really, really impact those prescription drugs and react to your body in a different way. So I do want to mention, because that is really important, as we layer different drugs and alcohol, your impairment might be much larger than you were used to before taking a prescription. And that's why it's very, very important to discuss side effects of medication that you're taking with the pharmacist. And when you have prescriptions that say do not operate heavy machinery, a car is heavy machinery. It's not just talking about going out to a construction site. It's a vehicle. And for me, why it's so personal is that loss, losing my only sibling that affects every single day of my life. Obviously, a huge impact for me. I was living in Kentucky at the time when I got the call to hear about my sister, and she was killed very quick. She passed away very quickly after the crash occurred. And first responders were actually right there at the intersection when she was hit. And what's important about that is it brings me a lot of peace, and that's why I think it is really important to recognize officers who are doing an exemplary job, because that's how prosecutors are able to get these people the help they need, the offenders, if they need help, but also potentially a sentence to make sure that they really understand the impact of the loss that we have in the community.
And I'm guessing that prior to the loss of your sister, the passion that you had was maybe less than what you have now. You seem extremely passionate about it, and as we would expect to be and have happened to prevent this from happening to other people and the loss of loved ones.
Yeah, I think Kelsey said it exactly. If you haven't been personally victimized or impacted by an impaired driver, then it does seem like something that's so far removed from you. And, through college, I have friends who have been arrested for operating while intoxicated. I know several people in the course of, the last 15 years whose lives have been affected by these crashes or themselves that have made poor decisions. And so when you have something happen that is literally so close to home, my sister was 2 blocks. She was a nurse at Community Hospital East on her way home from her shift and was killed just a few blocks from home. The person who killed her was actually speeding and increased their speed from 61 to 71 miles per hour in a 45 mile per hour speed limit zone, running a red light and running into my sister. And, their impairment was not over the legal 0.08, obviously over the legal limit for somebody who's underage. They were 19 at the time, but what's important about that is the impairment is there. Even with other people in the car, Having peers as well in the car with the impairment, that social aspect definitely changes the stakes for what can happen in a crash. And as I was talking about earlier, the first responders, that brought me a lot of peace knowing that they were there instantly to help. It was actually off-duty police officer, and they had footage from their squad car for the whole thing. So during prosecution, that was a very, very important thing, and they just happened to be there. And they decided to pull over and help. They weren't on the clock, they didn't have to, but they made that decision. And the peace that brought me, somebody who's very factually oriented and needs every fact to be able to work through the grief that I experienced, knowing that somebody was there immediately was incredibly cathartic for me. To know that she got immediate care and attention, and they did everything that they could.
Hearing Denise's story and her account, Kelsey and Austin, does that help you guys with what you're doing? I mean, being able to get convictions to help people learn lessons and being able to kind of pick out and see preventing, hopefully, something similar from happening to someone else in our community or beyond?
Yes, absolutely. And like Denise was saying, this was an underage kid, so the limit for underage kids is much lower than .08. And as we've been talking about impaired driving, drug driving, the conversation has really shifted from .08 as being the standard. It used to be, I think the slogan was .08 over the limit, under arrest. But now we've moved into drive sober or get pulled over, I think is a recent one. So that's kind of the old way of thinking. Buzz driving is drunk driving. So we're taking focus off of a number because, there used to not be a legal limit. You could just drive after drinking whatever you want. Then it was .15. And then it came down to .10. And here we are at .08, and there's conversations about going down to a .05 because, as Denise stated, impairment begins at .02. So, yeah, and like she said, prescription drugs, you can be taking your prescription drugs within the therapeutic level prescribed by your physician and still show signs of impairment, and you shouldn't be driving. I don't think people really wrap their heads around it. Like the whole "don't operate a vehicle or heavy machinery" thing.
I'm fine. I'm just I'm good.
And then it's really about personal responsibility, knowing how you feel in the moment, and knowing if you're feeling off, you really shouldn't drive, and you really shouldn't mix alcohol with your medication.
Austin, similarly, hoping to prevent something like that. I mean, does that fuel you in what you do?
Absolutely. Hearing that story actually gets me fired up to work even harder to deter the drunk drivers, the impaired drivers in the city of Lebanon. I know Kelsey just touched on like the pharmaceutical side as far as someone could be taking their prescription, and I think that's where it helps me as a DRE also, because people, especially like these Delta 8s and Delta 10 THCs that you can get at gas stations, people think since you buy it at a gas station, it's okay.
It's all good, right?
You're all right to get high and then get behind the wheel because you bought it at a gas station. You can legally get it, but you can't. You're still impaired. Sometimes it impairs you even more than the regular marijuana that people usually get. And that stuff doesn't show up on drug tests. So as a DRE, you can do evaluations on that to show and give an expert opinion that this person is under the influence of cannabis.
Everyone, we're listening to episode 109 of our Love in Lebanon podcast. A little bit more of a weighty topic than we usually do with the podcast, but nevertheless, an important one. We're kind of previewing Walk Like M.A.D., which is coming up in September the 16th at 10 a.m. It's happening at Memorial Park. And we got Denise and Kelsey and Austin here to kind of give us perspective on M.A.D. and things you should know. And I think it's honestly the perfect time of year to be doing a podcast like this as the weather gets better, as you're going to be outside. A lot of restaurants and events and things are going to have that inebriation element to them, and no matter what form. And so we're kind of previewing the walk, but also passing along some important information. If you can, as we kind of wrap things up here with this podcast episode, helpful hints for anyone that may be listening to this podcast, whether they have a loved one that's maybe has an issue, or they themselves, like things to keep in mind as they go about their daily lives to prevent injury to themselves and others. Anything you guys can provide from your different kind of walks of life and how the impairment side of things has affected it.
Well, with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and for my job specifically, we do get a lot of what we call concerned citizens calls where it might be people who know family members who are making really poor choices, or community members who are driving impaired even with their children in the car, and making really dangerous decisions that will impact their community. There is no if, it's just when. And I think that's a very, very important thing to really let sink in, because as a quote from the judge with dealing with the person who killed my sister, you're a ticking time bomb, because actual accidents happen every day. And when you add impairment to that, even if it's something that's not directly your fault, if you're impaired, you likely could have prevented a really catastrophic crash from happening. So it is important to have those conversations. As you mentioned, the time of year we're coming up on is prom season, a lot of dances,
prom, for sure.
a lot of graduation parties, a lot of basketball games, things like that. And it's important, even to those that we know, as you're 21 and older, making a good decision. But for those that are parents or aunt and uncles or role models, you need to have those conversations with your children. You might think they're not drinking or doing anything to impair, and maybe they're not. But there's always a question of, if there's some sort of peer pressure and they're in a situation where they might make a decision to either ride with someone who's impaired or drive themselves while being impaired for the fear of being in trouble, I would like to personally ask you to have those conversations now. Let them know, that you're there to support them, and you never want them to be in a situation that would cause harm to themselves or anyone else. So please do not get in the car with someone who might be impaired, so we can prevent these crashes and the loss of a loved one, or just an incredible change of life through these crashes.
Very well said, and won't be offended if you go the Patrick Swayze and Ghost route of saying ditto, Kelsey or Austin. But any other words of wisdom? That's excellent. And prom season, I didn't even register. Anything else to add, as far as you obviously want to take some preventative steps before they come see you as deputy prosecutor and have issues that way, or getting pulled over by a member of law enforcement?
Right. My best advice really is to always plan ahead.
Absolutely.
There are so many things coming up, like St. Patrick's Day, the NCAA tournament. Everyone likes to go out and have fun and drink alcohol, which is fine. Just make sure you're planning ahead. Have your designated driver. There's so many ride share possibilities now with the Uber, Lyft, getting a cab. Just make sure you're being responsible, and that you have that mindset before you start drinking, because as you consume alcohol, your judgment becomes more impaired. So just having that mindset of planning ahead is so important in having a responsible good time.
The odds of you making that call after you've had a few drinks, quite a bit less than before.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't drive there, you can't drive home. So that's always a very, just don't even have it be something you worry about. Make the plan to have a ride right from the beginning, and it's just off your mental load.
That's a good point too.
My best advice is something that I do. If it's on my breath, I don't get behind the wheel. I mean, even if I'm going to lunch and just having a beer with lunch, I'm not getting behind the wheel, because as they stated before, impairment starts way before .08. So though you might not be at .08, you're still impaired. And so if it's on your breath, stay away from the wheel.
Thanks so much, Denise and Kelsey and Austin.
If anybody ever needs help, if you've been impacted, or a loved one, anybody that you know has been impacted by a substance impaired crash, just know that I'm here with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and I'm here to help in any way that I can. Even if it was suspected, we have lots of services available to victims that can really help. And it's not a club that anyone wants to be a part of, but anybody who's been through traumatic situations knows that it can be really cathartic to have people in your corner to help you go through what you're potentially going to be going through.
And we'll put contact info for Matt and for you specifically within our podcast info as well, if anyone needs help in that way.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you passing that along. Thanks for being here, guys. Appreciate it very much. And thanks everybody listening to this episode of our Love in Lebanon podcast. More episodes are coming your way soon. Take care, everybody.